Well, good evening. Thanks for joining Gail and me for tonight's undergraduate research symposium. It's always a thrill to celebrate the work of our outstanding graduating seniors who have engaged in original research in partnership with and through the support of our amazing faculty. Celebrating your research accomplishments is particularly meaningful to me as I think back to when I was a student at Dartmouth 40 plus years ago. It was then that Professors Bob Norman, Jim Baumgartner, and Joanne Hutchinson in the math department convinced me that I, as a student, had the power to make new discoveries. I credit my own undergraduate research experience for giving me the motivation and the confidence to enter a PhD program in mathematics at Caltech immediately after graduating from Dartmouth. But today, it's all about you, our students who have worked so hard to advance your own understanding and create new knowledge to share with the world. I'm so proud of all you've accomplished, and I'm especially proud of the adaptability and fortitude you've shown in completing your senior honors thesis work through all the turmoil and changes brought about by COVID-19. Despite being thrown a curveball unlike any other, you didn't let it stop you from achieving your goals. And I know I speak for all of the family, friends, faculty, and staff members joining us today in saying that we're excited to honor your research accomplishments. In a typical year, Gail and I host a series of events at the President's House where graduating seniors who are writing an honors thesis are invited to enjoy dinner, share their work, and hear about the research other students have done in departments all across campus. But due to COVID, we've changed the format a bit and are hosting these symposiums virtually, so we can still have the opportunity to hear about our students and their exceptional work. So let's get to it. Jackson Danis, will you lead us off?
Of course, thank you very much. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Alrighty, can you guys see that?
Yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me here. My project is the design and validation of affordable heat flux sensing for the optimized actuation of green building elements. I know that's quite a mouthful, but in particular, this project is really looking at the effects of sensor noise on building energy usage. It falls under the umbrella of passive design, which is using things like direct solar heating, shading, and natural ventilation to offset mechanical heating and cooling, which is really important considering that 44% of the energy consumed by buildings in the US is used in space heating, air conditioning, and mechanical ventilation, most of which is generated by fossil fuels. Even marginal reductions then in heating and cooling load for individual buildings promise massive energy savings when used at the society level. Which, based on this work and other work, is something that's achievable given the relatively cheap cost to retrofit buildings with this technology as opposed to building green buildings from the ground up. So one of the basic principles of passive design is control of solar heat gain. The sun makes buildings warm, and it does so mostly through windows. This heat gain can be used to offset mechanical heating in the winter, but in the spring and summer, shown here, it's not always desirable. Fortunately, undesirable solar heat gain can be easily mitigated by simply pulling down a shade. Research indicates that controlling shading based on environmental parameters vastly increases performance over time shades or no shades at all. And that's what this thesis is really focused on. Some of the more promising control algorithms proposed for shades rely on sensing heat flux through the window at a given time, literally figuring out how much energy is coming into or out of a building through the window. These algorithms all rely on sensing idealized parameters within computational building models. In reality, the true heat flux can't be measured. There will always be some uncertainty. In previous work I did on this project, I constructed a heat flux sensor shown here in the upper left. And one of the most apparent problems with that was noise. If measured heat flux value is an unpredictable amount above or below the actual signal, that will induce errors in shade timing. It will either turn on a shade too early and prevent the desired heat gain, or turn it on too late and the space will be overheated. This thesis is investigating how large those errors are and what effects they have on building energy usage. Thus far, I have built and run Energy Plus and MATLAB co-simulations that turn shading on and off based on heat flux. Energy Plus is a building energy modeling engine. It gives fairly accurate predictions of building performance, and it can be run in MATLAB using an API. I've also created a noise model for Gaussian white noise that I've applied to the heat flux signal and used to trigger the shade within the building energy level. This graph here shows the performance of the building model as the modeled sensor becomes more and more noisy. Perfect sensor function down here in the lower left corner is effectively no noise. And then as the noise increases, the performance of the sensor dips. Having no shade is a value that is far, far off this graph. So any shade at all is an improvement on that. And really the region that we're interested in the most is this right here, in between what is a perfect shade, which is unachievable, and what is a time shade, which is the current art that's available in the world. The next steps for this will be to refine the noise model and test it in different climate zones. So far, it looks like noise does decrease performance, but not enough to make heat flux controls worse than time shading. And they still show massive improvements over no shade at all. And this shows promise for getting this technology out of the lab and into the world where we can build a greener future. There you go. Thank you.
Well, that was great. So given our neck of the country, is this technology better in places like New England, or can it be used throughout the country and maybe the world?
Yeah, it's really, the shading problem is most specific for regions that have like heating and cooling both simultaneously. So arid places that are very hot during the day and very cold at night, and places like New England and the mid-Atlantic and parts of the West Coast that have really long spring and fall seasons where you have warm days and cool nights. Any of those regions would show the most improvement out of this. Places that are hot all the time, the conductive heat gain through the window is far greater than would be affected by the shade. So it doesn't really matter how much sun is coming in. And then places that are cold all the time, you just basically always want the heat on. So New England in the winter, you wouldn't put your shade down at all. You would want to absorb all of that solar radiation.
Mm-hmm.
So Jackson, what technological hurdles, if any, would need to be overcome for this to be widely deployed, for your work to be widely deployed?
From the sensing perspective, noise and cost. There's plenty of work that's been done using research grade pyranometers or heat flux sensors, but those aren't economically feasible for a commercial product. And part of the ethos of this project is creating something that's more economical to bring green technology to people who it's generally not available for. There's also a lot of work to be done integrating the sensing into existing operable elements, things like shades and movable insulation for windows, natural ventilation. The systems that exist now aren't meant to take a sensor like this, so we need to do some work to integrate this.
Great.
Thank you, Jackson. That was awesome.
That was great.
Thank you.
Kara, do you want to go next?
Yes, absolutely. All right. So hello, everybody. My name is Kira Kohler, and I am a senior here studying economics and government. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about my economics thesis, which studies public firms who took out loans through the Paycheck Protection Program. And just to get started, I wanted to provide some background on what the Paycheck Protection Program actually is. And it was a part of the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, which was the largest COVID stimulus package released at the onset of the pandemic. And so this specific program got $659 billion to the program. Not all of it was used. And essentially what the PPP did was it offered loans to small businesses with the intent that these businesses would keep their employees on payroll for 8 weeks. So it was essentially intended to, decrease unemployment and keep as many people employed as possible. And what's really unique about this program is that these loans are completely forgivable. So if you do keep your employees on payroll, you get to keep the money. It's essentially cash. And so in total, almost 6 million businesses utilize this program throughout the US. A lot of firms on Main Street here in Hanover took out a PPP loan. I've spoken with the owners of Molly's, Stinson's, and Lou's. They all utilized the program and said that it was really consequential to their survival. And what I'm looking at is the public firms who took out these loans. And in total, there were 642 publicly traded firms. And so there was basically 3 ways you could be eligible to receive this loan. You had to be a small business by SBA standards. You needed to employ 500 or less employees, or you needed to be in the accommodation and food services industry. And I think the one thing that's really prominent when I talk about this topic is people think about Shake Shack and Ruth Chris's Steakhouse, which got a lot of heat at the onset of the pandemic for basically taking this free money when they already have access to the equity and capital markets. And so I just included a few screenshots here for your reference to show how the public was pretty angry about this. And so basically I'm asking 3 questions in my analysis here. So the first is I want to characterize these firms before they took out the loan. Secondly, I want to see how the loan affected their financial and their operational performance. And third, I wanted to look at their stock returns over time. And with that, I used Fama French factors. And to look at my data, so I essentially look at a number of variables to measure and characterize these firms. I look at firm size with assets and market values. I look at their profitability using return on assets. Tobin's Q is just a proxy for, investment opportunity. I look at their cash and debt levels, and then the big one, which is employee count, since these loans were intended to protect employment. And kind of moving on to what I actually find, as I think you would expect, it's pretty intuitive that the firms that did take out these loans were smaller in size, financially weaker, and they actually employed more individuals, which I think is really the only shocker there. Other than that, we see pretty much all negative numbers as far as these characteristics. Looking at the program's effect to measure this, I essentially simulated loan provisions across a number of different timeframes and found that these borrowers experienced a greater decrease in market capitalization and actually an increase in cash to assets. And that was really the only positive effect that I found. And while the employment change was not significant, it's pretty meaningful to see that these firms actually experienced almost a 12% decrease in employment after receiving these loans, which is pretty important considering that these loans were intended to protect employment. And if you do the math, the government essentially paid $850,000 for every job lost with these public companies, which is a lot of money, obviously. And then my final kind of results portion that I wanted to cover is just the stock returns. And we found that these borrowers actually experienced a greater stock return in the months following the provision of these loans, which I guess is pretty surprising. But I also found that the increases in valuation are pretty equivalent to the average loan size. Here we see the 8-month return. They experienced a 2.74% greater increase in stock return, which is pretty close to what you would find if you just handed these firms a cash loan through the Paycheck Protection Program. It pretty much came out to the same number. So before I take Q&A, just kind of my overview and takeaway from this project is that the Paycheck Protection Program definitely helped the firms on Main Street, these small guys that really were struggling to keep their employees on payroll, but it was not as consequential to larger public firms that I studied in here. Thank you.
That was great. So given your analysis, what types of firms were most likely to apply for this program?
Yeah, so as I said before, I found that the firms prior to receiving these loans or even applying for them were smaller in size and financially weaker. But one thing that I also studied is just, the classification of these firms by industry. And 60% of these firms were in the manufacturing industry, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. Another notable kind of takeaway is just that a lot of the firms that elected to return these loans were massively bigger than the other firms that took out the loans. So that's like Shake Shack and Ruth Chris's. They were pretty big in comparison to a lot of the other public companies that took out the loan.
So Kira, thanks. One question on your slides, the stars and the double stars and triple stars, I assume that's statistical significance at some p-value, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Good. So I guess channeling public sentiment, do you feel like larger firms like Shake Shack should have been eligible after doing this research, or not, should not have been eligible?
I personally don't think that they should have been eligible. As I said before, the loan did not serve its intention, its purpose is to keeping as many people on payroll as possible with these firms. And that said, I think the government kind of picked up on that in the last stimulus package that was just released. Public firms were excluded from being eligible to withdraw these loans. So overall, I don't think that these public firms should have eligibility to take out what's essentially a cash handout.
Great. Thank you, Kira. That was awesome. Simon Oster, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is Simon, and I'm a 21 studying engineering sciences with a concentration in mechanical engineering. And the topic of my thesis is the thermal conductivity of polar fern. So to start, what is polar fern? Across the vast Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, in areas that are too cold for annual snowmelt, surface snow becomes compressed over time as it's buried under new snow year after year. As it's compressed, it transforms into fern, which is a solid porous material shown here on the right. With increased depth, these layers of fern become increasingly compressed, and the large interconnected pores that we see near the surface become closed off at lower depths, thereby trapping the air inside, and eventually this compression transforms the fern into ice. As a result of this transformation, the microstructure of fern, including its porosity and density, vary greatly across the fern layer, which can range from 20 to 120 meters in depth. The near surface or top layer of fern can be sensed using remote techniques, such as satellite imagery that detects electromagnetic signals dependent on the fern. Professor Mary Albert, my research advisor, has about 120 meters of fern core samples from the South Pole in her cold room there. To accurately interpret these remote measurements of fern and to accurately apply them to climate models, such as heat and mass balances of the ice sheets, we need to first know how heat travels through the fern. Best metric for this property is the thermal conductivity, which quantifies the rate of heat conduction through material. Although there are estimations that are currently used to model heat transfer through fern, no direct measurements of the thermal conductivity of fern have ever been taken. So, to address this gap in knowledge, I designed and built a device that can directly measure the thermal conductivity of fern samples. On the left here is a cross-sectional model of the device, and on the right is the actual device in lab. The device was first tested in the -25°C cold room using materials of known thermal conductivity, such as clay and wax, to ensure its accuracy. To determine the thermal conductivity of a fern sample, all we need to know is the difference in temperature across the sample, the heat flux through the sample, and the height of it. So in this apparatus, a heater warms the bottom of the fern sample by a few degrees Celsius, from about -25 to -22, and thermocouples and heat flux sensors above and below the sample record this data. After approximately 6 hours, the fern reaches steady state, and then we can use those final temperature and heat flux measurements to determine that fern sample's thermal conductivity. 7 fern samples from the South Pole fern core were selected to be tested, ranging in depth from 8 to 47 meters, and 4 to 5 tests were run on each sample. On the left here is a plot of the measured thermal conductivity as a function of the fern's density, and on the right is the measured thermal conductivity as a function of the sample's depth in the fern layer. As these green lines overlaid on the plots indicate, there is a strong linear trend between both pairs of measurements. What this means is that with increased depth in the fern layer, so as we go deeper and deeper, the fern can conduct heat more rapidly. And although we have found a great trend overall with depth and density, there are still small scale variations between the samples that lead us to wonder what microstructural feature or features determine the thermal conductivity of fern, or in a nutshell, why are these measurements what they are? To address this next stage of the research, I turned to microcomputed tomographs, or micro-CTs, of the samples, which were collected by a previous PhD student of Professor Albert. The micro-CT scanner uses X-rays to provide quantitative data on many microstructural aspects of the fern samples. And of the various microstructural features that I investigated, 2 provided useful results here: the degree of anisotropy, which quantifies the 3-dimensional symmetry of the sample, and the structural model index, which describes the convexity or concavity of the sample's inner structure. What we see when we analyze these characteristics is that for deeper fern samples, there's a clear trend between each the degree of anisotropy and the structural model index with the measured thermal conductivity. However, for the near surface fern samples, those at the top, there was no real consistent trend with these two or any of the other microstructural features considered for that matter, meaning that these microstructural features might play a role in determining the thermal conductivity of fern below a certain depth, but they don't determine it for thermal conductivity of fern for all depths. And so having no definitive conclusion from just the microscopic data itself, I turned to the micro-CT images, which are these 2D image slices of the fern samples. And while this final stage of my research is ongoing, the working hypothesis here is that the thermal conductivity of fern is related to the ice particle size and interconnectedness. So, for example, take the two image slices shown here on the screen. The left one is from a fern sample of only 11 meters in depth, and the right one is from a fern sample of 47 meters in depth. For these given slices shown, the total porosities are within a few percent of each other. However, you can see by visual inspection that in the right image, the white and black speckles, which correlate to the ice and pore space, respectively, are more clumped together, while in the left image, they're more granular. And as it turns out, the samples who show this pattern of high ice particle interconnectedness tend to also have high thermal conductivities. The hypothesized reason being that thicker pathways of ice allow for the heat to conduct more rapidly through them than in the more granular samples. Some final analysis on my part remains to be done to test this robustness of this hypothesis, though the findings currently look promising. All in all, this research has resulted in the first ever direct measurements of the thermal conductivity of fern, which is really exciting, and additionally offers an explanation as to how these microstructures determine thermal conductivity. So looking to the future, scientific work can continue in this direction of quantifying and modeling this relationship between ice particle interconnectedness and the thermal conductivity of fern, which can hopefully provide another powerful modeling tool for scientists. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That was incredibly interesting. Can you tell us how your research could be used by a broader scientific community?
Sure. So these measurements of the thermal conductivity of fern are the first that have ever been directly measured. And so fern layers extend across the entire Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, and these sheets hold just under 2/3 of all the Earth's fresh water. And so with the climate warming, we'll begin to see mass releases and melts from these ice sheets, which will pour fresh water into the currently salty ocean water. And we know that this drastic increase in salinity will disrupt the ocean currents patterns, which we have right now, and that'll cause widespread climatic changes across the globe. And so because of these impending dramatic changes, it's critical to know the rate at which the ice sheets are melting. So we're capable of remotely surveying the ice sheets from satellites, but without knowing how the fern layer transfers heat from the surface to the ice below, those measurements can't be fully interpreted accurately.
Simon, I have one last question. Thermal conductivity, it's a basic material property. Why has there not been a measurement of the polar fern thermal conductivity until now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the use of satellites to monitor the ice sheets has only recently come into its prime within the last 10 years or so. Because of the harsh climate and the vast remote nature of the ice sheets, this remote sensing technique through satellites provides an effective way to monitor the ice sheets from afar, which we didn't have before. So previously we had this, before we had this capability, there was no real urgency to know the thermal conductivity of fern because it couldn't be applied in too many areas. But now that we have these large scale, up-to-date models being created through the satellite imagery, there is a huge importance in knowing the thermal conductivity of fern so that these models can accurately predict all these different aspects of what the ice sheets will do in the next 5, 10, and even 50 years to give us the best chance of understanding and preparing for what may come.
Great, thank you. Liam, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm excited to share with you guys. Thanks for having me. You see my presentation all right?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. So the title of my project was Development of NMR Compatible NEMO Constructs for Inhibitor Screening. And this was done in the chemistry department with my advisors, Dale Mirkey and Maria Pellegrini. So one of the gold standards in drug development nowadays is to gain a structure of a protein that you wish to target, and then use that structure to design small molecules or other proteins that bind to it, change its behavior, and have some therapeutic value. And so the techniques used in the laboratory to determine the structure of a protein are X-ray crystallography, in which protein is crystallized and then X-rays are diffracted through it, and then you can resolve the structure from the diffraction pattern. And the technique that I was using, which was nuclear magnetic resonance, which uses the properties of the nucleus of an atom when placed in a magnetic field to measure different properties about the protein, and then to resolve its structure based on information between distances between different nuclei. And once a structure has been resolved, you can also generate structures of protein ligand complexes and understand the binding pose of a specific small molecule and start to grow these into drugs that can be used in the clinic. And computational methods are widely used in the development of these ligands for screening in the laboratory. So my target is part of the NF-kappa B pathway, which can be divided between the canonical NF-kappa B pathway and the non-canonical NF-kappa B pathway, both of which are implicated in inflammatory response, but specifically the canonical pathway is implicated in inflammation, cell survival, and proliferation. And upregulation of the canonical pathway or dysregulation of this pathway is associated with autoimmune diseases like arthritis, inflammatory diseases, diabetes, and certain cancers. However, the non-canonical pathway is extremely important for having proper functioning of the immune system. So global inhibition of NF-kappa B is very damaging to the immune system. So the challenge becomes, how can you develop a inhibitor that is specific to the canonical pathway and leaves the non-canonical pathway untouched? And NEMO is a scaffolding protein that recruits these two kinases, IKK alpha and IKK beta, which then turns on this pathway and allows for transcription of pro-inflammatory genes. If you can inhibit the association between NEMO and these kinases, that would be a great drug to be able to shut off the canonical pathway, and NEMO is not required for non-canonical pathway activity. So the structure of NEMO, it's been known as a good drug target for more than 20 years. However, the structure has been extremely difficult to resolve because it's in conformational, conformational flexibility with a variety of different structures. And that's the enemy of a lot of these structure-based methods. If you have a lot of different structures, either your protein won't crystallize or you'll have a tough time getting signal in NMR. So our ideology is that we could stabilize the structure of NEMO, which is a coiled coil, two coils wrapped around each other, by mutating residues to facilitate Coulombic attractions, salt bridges, or increasing the hydrophobic core of this protein to really decrease the conformational flexibility of this protein. This was some data that we recorded on thermal denaturation of these proteins, and this was monitoring the ellipticity of circular dichroism at 220, which is a measurement of the alpha helical content of your protein. The more negative this is, the more alpha helices they are. So we can monitor the unfolding of these alpha helices. And looking just at the delta G at 25 degrees Celsius for this unfolding process, we see that these coiled coil optimized structures, these last three, are significantly more stable than the wild type sequence. And what this results in is an NMR spectrum that looks significantly better than the wild type. So the wild type here is shown in red, and you can see that the signals are all jumbled and you can't really resolve distinct peaks. This is read like a topographic map with each little circle being a resonance of a specific point that you're measuring. And we should be able, in this experiment, this is a heteronuclear single quantum correlation experiment where we're coupling this nitrogen to this hydrogen, and we should only get one of these couplings per amino acid in our protein. This is a 67 residue protein, so there should be 67 peaks. And we're getting significantly closer with these constructs to having NMR compatibility. Great, thank you so much.
Great. I'm not quite sure I understood all of that, but I think you did a great job explaining it to people who have no background. what do you think are the difficulties of targeting protein-protein interaction for drug design?
That's a good question. So protein-protein interactions are definitely a specialty of Dale Mierke and Maria Pellegrini, my advisors. And the difficulties in targeting a protein-protein interaction are that they're often very large interfaces and with not very well-defined binding pockets, very shallow binding pockets. So it's hard to find a small molecule that will bind strongly to that pocket. However, there's been significant progress in identifying hotspots along these protein-protein interactions, maybe through mutational analysis. If you mutate this residue, oh, we interrupted binding. Therefore, that specific amino acid is very important for the binding process, and we can develop drugs that bind to those hotspot residues. And that's kind of the progress that's been made in that area.
Great.
Liam, where did computation come into your approach, and why was that valuable at the?
Right. So I've definitely implemented a lot of computational methods alongside the laboratory methods. And the two main ones were molecular docking, which uses a force field to calculate the binding pose of a specific molecule in your protein. And that can be used to screen large databases of lots of drugs and potentially purchase a few to actually test in the laboratory. And then also molecular dynamics, which provides a little bit more of a realistic description. You're updating the trajectory of your molecule at every time frame based on all the forces that are acting on it. So I think that these simulations are a cool mix between computational chemistry and, sorry, the lights just turned off in the office. And drug development. So it's definitely computers are being used more and more to help push drugs through these initial phases of the design towards having a molecule that binds your target well and can be tested in an animal model of the disease.
Great. Thanks, Liam. That's terrific. Roxy, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. And I'm having some Wi-Fi issues right now, so apologies if I cut out. My thesis is entitled Spy Cultures, a Comparative Analysis of Soviet and American Intelligence Operations During the Cold War. It was completed in the Russian department and presents a comparative analysis of these operations and their representation in film. My analysis identified three main trends. The first is the disproportionate use of technological intelligence versus human intelligence, wherein the US favored technological intelligence and the USSR favored human intelligence. The second is the difference in perception of the main adversary. The US largely focused on the USSR, while the USSR split its attention between the US and its own people. The third is the push in both countries to force intel to fit pre-existing assumptions about the enemy. My thesis discusses these trends and also analyzes the key economic, cultural, and historical factors that led to their emergence. Key differences include open versus closed society, capitalist versus communist economy, and experience with intelligence operations. These factors led the two countries to pursue intelligence operations in culturally specific ways and contributed directly to the trends listed above. In addition to the political and historical context provided by scholarly sources, I present my findings from interviews I conducted with former American intelligence agents. These interviews focus on their professional experience during the Cold War. Lacking the opportunity to interview Russian intelligence agents myself, I incorporated into my analysis several previously recorded interviews with Soviet intelligence operatives and defectors, in addition to reading a memoir by a former agent to provide analogous information from the Soviet perspective. These conversations help construct an image of the intelligence communities in each country from the insider perspective. The information that I received through the interviews overall supports the conclusions presented in the scholarly sources, but at the same time, there were far more nuances in the answers given by the informants themselves. I used the comparative analysis of American and Soviet intelligence in scholarly sources and in the interviews to evaluate the cultural and artistic significance of cinematic presentations of intelligence operations in the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War. I performed case studies of 3 Soviet and 3 American films. Each theme was present in the films I analyzed, but the trends were not always explicit or presented exactly as they would have occurred in real life due to the propagandized nature of films and artistic choices. At times, the themes were even questioned by the films. One clear example of the trends being present but challenged in film can be seen in Failsafe. Failsafe focuses almost exclusively on how the increased reliance on technology, especially in intelligence work, can lead to catastrophic consequences. It is evident that as technology continues to evolve, there are increasing amounts of suspicion and resentment associated with the unknowns about technology. Even though the message is presented in the form of grievances, it's clear that there is a prioritization of technology over human intelligence in the US. This prioritization, however, is questioned by the film because it ultimately leads to the loss of Moscow and New York City to nuclear warheads. Finally, my thesis presents a case study of Bridge of Spies to illustrate the difference in how the trends are implemented and challenged in modern films about the Cold War when compared to films produced during the Cold War. One example of how the trends are present but challenged in new ways can be seen in the exchange of spies at the end of the film. The lawyer orchestrating this exchange is worried that when the Soviet spy Abel returns to the USSR, he'll be shot or tortured, whereas there's no fear that this may happen to the American pilot Powers upon his return to the US. This illustrates the idea that the US treats people more humanely than the USSR and therefore reinforces the pre-existing framework. However, the fact that the lawyer is worried for Abel's safety and that Abel is willing to wait longer to return home to make sure that the exchange goes is human. This thesis, of course, is not a synthesis of all trends present in Cold War era intelligence or in all Cold War era films, but a sampling of topics and films on which I decided to focus. That being said, I believe that my observations and conclusions will contribute to the understanding of the broader questions that pertain to intelligence activities during the Cold War and the representation in film. Thanks for listening, and I would be glad to answer any questions.
That was fascinating. So you looked at both scholarly sources and then interviewed people. Was there, what were the key things that you learned or the differences between what you learned from interviewing people and from the scholarly sources?
Yeah, so my interviewees made key distinctions on every trend. For the disproportionate use of technology, they made two. The first being that there was a different emphasis on types of intelligence was not purposeful, it just happened to be that way. And the second was that even within technology-based intelligence, different types of technologies were used in both countries. As far as the split focus of the Soviet intelligence apparatus, they emphasized that the Soviets accounted for not only their own citizens, but also their near and power-hungry neighbors, such as China, and their force allies in the Eastern Bloc countries. And they added the most nuance to the idea of a pre-existing framework, arguing that information fit to a framework may not always be purposeful, but a product of indoctrination throughout the Cold War. They also pointed out that language can cause misinterpretations in intelligence, or could be used as a device to help misinterpretations be pushed forward and help info fit a existing framework. Finally, they discussed the dangers of treating large and diverse countries as uniform, and that the Soviets often struggled to follow a consistent framework due to how quickly the US changes power structures compared to them.
So the US and the USSR were bitter arch enemies during the Cold War. So presumably they weren't sharing best practices. Despite that, are there ways in which you found that the intelligence services operated in similar ways?
Yeah, so despite being framed as the antithesis to one another, they shared some common characteristics. The biggest similarity is the existence of a framework about the enemy in both countries. And this was enforced in citizens through media, government, and social norms. And it affected the thinking of the citizens and the way intelligence worked and was interpreted in both countries. Also, the blurring of the lines between propaganda and entertainment during the Cold War was common to both. And in entertainment, both countries went through different phases with films that reflected the current political climates of their country. And finally, both countries respected and acknowledged the other side as equal adversaries. It was described to me by one of my interviewees as a gentleman's chess game where everybody knew and respected the rules.
Great.
Thanks. Mary Joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Give me 1 second to get my presentation up, and then I will present. Okay, can everyone see that first slide?
Yep.
It's just the name of my thesis, nothing special. So President Hanlon and Gail, thank you for being here, and to everyone in the audience, thank you as well for tuning in to see what we did. I'm not going to read to you the name of my thesis. It's a lot of words. And so what I'm going to go into over this talk is just explaining what I did and what all of this means. But the general gist of it, which I'll give some more background on, is about bones and movement in primates. I did it through the Department of Anthropology, and my advisors were Dr. Jeremy De Silva and Luke Fannin, who is a PhD candidate in the Triple ES department, excuse me. So each of us carries around with us a living manuscript of what we did in life. It's our bones. Remodeling, lipping, even stray marks can be traced back very accurately to childhood bike accidents, sibling wrestling matches, and the process of aging. Even the injuries that no longer hurt, the ones that we've probably forgotten, our bones remember. And patterns in bone tell an even larger story, the story of evolution by natural selection, of modification to fit a changed environment. We can look at the bones of different species and note differences that were caused by something. One such pattern, which I talked about, is in the upper limb. For those of you who are watching, think about when you woke up and stretched this morning. You probably lifted your arms high above your head, fully extending your elbows around 180 degrees without even thinking about it. You and our ape relatives can do that primarily because of a few bony features, which you'll see on your screen. The glenoid fossa of the scapula, your shoulder joint, of apes and of you, is relatively flat, allowing your humerus to tilt fully upward. But in arboreal monkeys, it's curved, which you can see on the right, making their shoulders much less flexible. At the elbow joint, your olecranon process, that's your funny bone, folks, is short, so it doesn't create any obstruction between your ulna and your humerus. In monkeys, it's bulky to avoid collapse of the forelimbs during quadrupedal motion. But the real question is why? Why did apes and us need more mobile arms? One potential reason, which I decided to test, is vertical climbing. So I designed an observational study that used software to test the maximal excursion of the shoulder and elbow angles during vertical climbing of chimpanzees and sooty mangabes, one of the few regularly vertically climbing cercopithecoroids. I posited that if vertical climbing were a significant driver of upper limb anatomical evolution, there would be differences in maximal angle extension between the two species. So in lieu of going through the p-values and the endless amount of math that we went through, I'll just interpret our results. They told us that there are significant differences between the way the two species climb, but they're actually driven not by upward climbing, but by downward climbing. Downward movement, unlike upward movement, has the problem of gravity, which for small primates is no big deal. Falls aren't that dangerous. If you've ever seen a squirrel fall off one of the houses in Hanover, you'll know what I'm talking about. For large primates, it's a delicate dance between safety and energetics. If you propel yourself downward too quickly, your body exerts a higher force on the branches, overloading them and leading to falls, which based on the power of impact with the ground is likely fatal at this weight. But move too slowly and your full weight will shock load your joints and strain your muscles, tiring you and resulting in, you guessed it, a fall. So what's the solution? More or less a punctuated free falling motion, something that's not possible with stiff, locked elbows and tight shoulders. And so as hominoids evolved larger, natural selection chipped away at these bony features, creating a more flexible upper limb to keep them safe as they climb downward from trees. But since I imagine most of y'all don't spend your free time dreaming of the curvature of the glenoid fossa, why does any of this matter? It lets us extend the story of humanity a little further back. Since now we understand how climbing leaves its mark on the bones of chimpanzees, we can match those markings to the human fossils we now have to answer the burning questions of human history. Like, when did we leave the trees for good to walk? By studying the bones of the upper limb in monkeys and apes, we can now add to the story of humanity. And so I'll leave you, since I'm the last person presenting, with one final note. I talked a lot today about stories, about how science lets us read the behavior and history of a whole species from bones. So I'll challenge you, when you see someone who looks different from you and thinks differently from you, think about this. You and I and them all carry the same history, the marks of the same evolutionary struggle to survive in an adverse world, written deep in the canvas of our bones. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
That was great. Thanks, Mary Jo. So I think you kind of explained my question already about why do you study in anthropology, which is this, I thought, study of people, why you were studying monkeys and apes. But can you talk a little bit more about how studying these primates really does relate so much to humans?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to understand that we have last common ancestors with chimpanzees, and even earlier on with some of the arboreal monkeys that I talked about. And so understanding how evolution affected them, particularly their bones, tells us what forces were at play during early human history. One of the big questions is always, when did humans start walking? When did they leave the trees for good? Were they still climbing around the time that we have some of our well-known fossils like Lucy? And so if we understand how climbing leaves its mark on the bones of chimpanzees, we can sort of extrapolate that using statistical inference and whatever we have with the fossil record to be able to see whether or not those same marks are present on some of our earlier ancestors like Australopithecus afarensis, which is Lucy is an example of that. And so if they have the same scapula shape and the same curvature or lack thereof of the glenoid fossa, we can see, they were still climbing pretty strongly back then. But if they lack those, then we can say, oh, there was probably not much going on there. And that helps us a lot, because a lot of these bones, like scapulas and different parts of the upper arm, don't preserve very well in the fossil record based on where they're found.
Right.
Mary Jo, given the results in your thesis, where do researchers go next? What are the questions that come after what you've discovered?
Yeah, so my advisors and I have been thinking a lot about this in the past couple of weeks, particularly because this is the first quantitative comparison of chimpanzees and wild monkeys in the wild, I should say, outside of captivity. And one of the things that we have wanted to reintroduce to the field is an acceptance of downward climbing as being a movement that affects that evolutionarily affects the bones. A lot of researchers since Theodore Grand in the 1970s haven't really considered downward climbing at all in their studies of climbing, and so wanting to expand the definition, perhaps of vertical climbing, or at least revisit the hypothesis and say, you need to look at downward climbing as being an important evolutionary force. So that would be where we go next.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you. This was just amazing presentations, both the depth of what you looked at, but also the breadth of the work. And I think this shows just once again that undergraduate research is amongst the most powerful experiential learning opportunities we provide on our campus. I truly believe that. It is a way for students to exercise and hone the very skills that a liberal arts education seeks to cultivate. It involves you asking the right questions, working independently and on teams, being resilient and resourceful in the face of setbacks, making connections, building relationships, and learning how to draw meaningful conclusions and communicate those conclusions effectively. So I really can't think of a better or more timeless set of intellectual skills to instill in our graduates, particularly at this moment in time. So to close, let me just offer my thanks, first of all, to all the faculty advisors who have mentored and supported these students in their research. And to everyone in attendance for your interest and your enthusiasm for the amazing research that we just heard about. And to any students with us tonight who have not yet taken advantage of the incredible research opportunities afforded to you at Dartmouth, I hope you will feel inspired to take that leap. So thanks again for joining us. We are holding another symposium tomorrow evening at 5:30. I hope you'll join us to hear from another group of graduating seniors about the research from their honors theses. And the link to that can be found on the Dartmouth events page. So thanks to all of you again for joining, and congratulations to all of the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you.